Silence. It flashed from the woodwork and the walls. It smote him with an awful, total power, as if generated by a vast mill. It rose up from the floor, up out of the tattered gray wall-to-wall carpeting. It unleashed itself from the broken and semi-broken appliances in the kitchen, the dead machines which hadn't worked in all the time Isidore had lived here. From the useless pole lamp in the living room it oozed out, meshing with the empty and wordless descent of itself from the fly-specked ceiling. We're headed for another one of our recurring segments. Maybe you remember this, but I feel like we do have a recurring segment where Chris remembers something formative that Jesse said over 2 decades ago.
Oh, yeah, very common.
It's like a very normal segment for us. Do you remember describing Davis as the place that you want to move to if you want to live in California, but you actually want to live in Nebraska?
No, but that's good.
It is good.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very good. I've remembered it for over 15 years.
I sometimes wonder if you have another friend or other friends who are also clever and you just attribute all the good quotes to me.
Maybe.
I'm like a, white middle-aged middle manager in a writer's room, just like hoovering up all the good ideas.
You're the opposite of Dorian Gray, but in a writerly term.
I don't actually know Dorian Gray, unfortunately.
Oh, well, but Dorian Gray never gets old, but there's a picture of him getting ancient in like a room somewhere.
Oh,
and,
yeah.
And so yes, there's like a dumb Jesse Dukes in a closet that you've hid away somewhere. And this one is the one that is spouting all of the magic.
A replicant, as it were.
Yeah, nice, good segue. We got there.
Well, what are we talking about today?
We are talking about Philip K. Dick's 1968 novella, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which was turned into the Ridley Scott. I wasn't sure. I was like, I'm pretty sure it's Ridley Scott, and
yes.
Now I'm just going to say it and be like, I didn't check that before wandering in here. The 1982 Ridley Scott film Blade Runner. Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep has kind of attained the status of, I'd say, classic.
Yeah, well,
we're not even going to throw any modifiers on that.
And what I don't actually know is, was it considered a classic before Blade Runner, or is it sort of famous as the source material for Blade Runner? I suspect it's more the latter. I suspect more people have seen Blade Runner than have read this book. That would be my guess. And I suspect many people who have read it after seeing the movie, at least in our generation, or people our age or younger.
That's certainly true for me.
Oh, yeah.
I wonder. I think this book, I'm tipping my hand, I think this book is deserving of classic status without the movie. It's hard for me to say that, but I don't know. It's going to be interesting to walk through this together because like a lot of books in this genre, there are moments of brilliance and some moments of clunkiness. And I'm really excited to talk about it, but let's get into the recap. Do you want to kick it off?
Yeah. Okay. So we meet Deckard and his wife. We learn pretty quickly that he's somehow police adjacent, and he hunts Andes, which we figure out pretty quickly are androids, which sometimes malfunction and escape and threaten humans. And we meet him in a kind of a waking argument with his wife about something called a mood organ, which is a device you dial and to set your mood. That's kind of the first chapter, is they have a long argument about that. And then he goes up onto his roof. Everybody in this world has kind of flying cars, hover cars, sort of like, and so the roof is the parking area. And up on the roof, he encounters a neighbor, and we learn from the conversation he has with his neighbor that Deckard, in fact, has an electric sheep, to his dismay. He wants a real sheep, and we learn sort of through kind of, if you're paying close attention to the conversation, what you sort of figure out is that there has been a terrible war, and that one of the results of the war is that most non-human animals on Earth have died. Many people have left Earth and gone to colonies, I think on Mars and maybe other places too. There's radiation. So people have to wear like radiation suits and glasses and lead cod pieces. He heads off to work after having this conversation with his neighbor who has a horse, a Percheron, I think, who is pregnant. And he is openly, nakedly jealous of his neighbor. And we learn pretty quickly that animals, domestic animals, wild animals, are just considered incredibly valuable in this world for their scarcity. And that in the same way that somebody in 1960s might covet their neighbor's Cadillac, this is a world of 2019 in post-World War T. I think World War Terminus, in which people covet each other's animals. And many, many people apparently have ersatz fake electric animals designed to fool their neighbors and friends. And I'll let you take it from there.
There's a real sense of keeping up with the Jetsons.
That's a good way to put it. Keeping up with the Jetsons, yeah.
Yeah. We meet a second character in the early chapters named J.R. Isidore, who is a special.
Yeah.
So specials are people whose genetics have been wounded by the fallout from the World War. They're not allowed to reproduce, and they're not allowed to emigrate. Worse for JR, he's also failed an intelligence test, so he is called a chicken head, a chicken head special.
Yeah.
Really a very maligned class of people in this particular world. People just slightly less well off than even him end up in psychiatric institutions, and he lives alone in an empty apartment building. As does Deckard and his wife live in an apartment building that is somewhat habitated, but it's a lot of the apartment buildings are empty or emptying.
A lot of people have left Earth because of the fallout.
Yeah. And this chapter ends with JR discovering that there's somebody else in the building, and he goes to meet them and discovers that it is a woman who acts a little strangely, gives him a few different names that he can call her by, but they end up striking up an acquaintance. But he is left feeling a little unsettled by the experience. We shift on back to Deckard, who gets a retire list, which is a list of androids he needs to go and track down, because the head bounty hunter of the San Francisco Police Department, what a great title, has been wounded in the line of work. And Deckard begins the process of tracking down these androids. He flies to Seattle, which appears to only take less. It's like less than a normal commute time. He makes it back to the office later that afternoon, and his boss says something like, "Well, that didn't take you long," or something like that. But while he's in Seattle, he meets the company, the Rosen Corporation, who make the problematic androids in question, which is a model called the Nexus 6. And they try to trick him into invalidating the test that he uses to discover androids. He sees through the ruse and actually identifies one of the Rosen family as an android herself. And I will kick it back to you.
Sure. And we go back to J.R. Isidore. And one other thing about that chapter is that he has this... He at one point plugs into something called an empathy box and engages in kind of a shared, what William Gibson might call a voluntary shared hallucination with apparently millions of people and an entity, a person, a human, an alien.
Wilbur Mercer.
Wilbur Mercer, who kind of comes across as like an older version of Jesus, who is climbing up a mountain and communicating. And it is a kind of shared virtual reality religious experience that also leads to him getting an actual cut on his arm, where Mercer receives a stone thrown from somebody, the enemy, on his arm too. And there's a lot of religious significance to this. And JR feels emotionally and spiritually grounded after having this experience. It manages a lot of his anxiety. So JR, we see him at work. He accidentally treats a real cat that he thinks is a mechanical cat, and that cat dies. It's probably not his fault, but his boss is a real a-hole and makes him, just because he's a chicken head and has a stutter, makes him call the owner of the cat and explain what happens. And then in a really interesting moment, he does a surprisingly good job at that. And one of the things that one starts to suspect, at least I start to suspect, is that Isidore is not really that stupid. He might be kind of slow to put things together, and he might have a lot of social anxiety. I think he might be what we might call kind of like neuroatypical today, but he doesn't really seem unintelligent. He has a very intelligent vocabulary, and he's very perceptive. And he even, manages this customer service call with a certain amount of aplomb, despite his stutter. And that's kind of interesting. I think it's one of the themes around labeling and tests and the categories that this broader society is assigning to different kinds of people, other entities. And then, we're back to Deckard on his case.
There's like some logistical shell game stuff where his boss is like, oh, there's like a Russian police investigator who's coming, so like you gotta wait for him. And Deckard's like, no, I want to go get started, send him after me. And through this kind of like shuffling, he thinks he meets up with the Russian cop. The Russian cop is not the Russian cop. It is the android who almost kills Deckard, but he's able to deploy something that kind of invalidates the laser gun that the android is wielding, and Deckard blows his head off with a slug thrower.
Interesting.
Just a normal old pistol.
Snub-nosed 38 special.
He's like cleaning the brains out of his hover car and talks to his boss and is like, I'm going for the next one. It's just like, wow, he's really like getting after it. He wants those bounties.
Well, he wants the bounties because he wants to buy a real animal too. That's also one of the things that's set up.
Hilarious scene where he calls up a pet store and tries to negotiate down the price of an ostrich.
That's true. Yes.
The ostrich is priced below market at $29,000. And a mechanical ostrich is only $800.
The animals cost as much as homes.
Yeah. So Deckard goes after the next android, an opera singer. She manages to kind of outwit him and calls the police. There's this very odd scene where Deckard doesn't recognize this cop. That wouldn't seem strange, but then the cop takes him to a different police station. And it's a completely walled off android police station that is posing as a real police station, we learned. The police chief that he's talking to is an android. The bounty hunter of this police station is also an android, but doesn't know it. And
we think, it is.
We think. Yeah. We're pretty sure, but it hasn't been proved yet.
Right.
And the bounty hunter ends up killing his boss, the police chief, and kind of walks Deckard out of there. And they head off to try to track down the opera singer. And that is the end of chapter 11, where we read up to today.
Quite cliffhangery, too.
Yeah. It's the chapters do end pretty nicely, I think. Like, they usually they either close well or they do lead really nicely to something next. So yeah, the thing I wanted to do was do a kind of close examination of the opening scene. The game I had was I was just going to read the first page and a half or page or so.
Okay.
And I want you to keep track of or note the number of like things that are not that we don't get explained to us.
Yep.
Like new devices, new ways of thinking. I don't know, maybe when we edit this we can put little like dings or something for every new thing.
Sure.
Okay. So, chapter 1. A merry little surge of electricity piped by automatic alarm from the mood organ beside his bed awakened Rick Deckard. Surprised, it always surprised him to find himself awake without prior notice. He rose from the bed, stood up in his multicolored pajamas, and stretched. Now, in her bed, his wife Erin opened her gray, unmerry eyes, blinked, then groaned, and shut her eyes again. "You set your Penfield too weak," he said to her. "I'll reset it, and you'll be awake, and keep your hand off my settings." Her voice held bitter sharpness. "I don't want to be awake." He seated himself beside her, bent over her, and explained softly, "If you set the surge up high enough, you'll be glad you're awake. That's the whole point. At setting C, it overcomes the threshold bar in consciousness, as it does for me." Friendly, because he felt well disposed towards the world, his setting had been at D. He patted her bare, pale shoulder. "Get your crude cop's hand away," Erin said. "I'm not a cop." He felt irritable now, although he hadn't dialed for it. "You're worse," his wife said, her eyes still shut. "You're a murderer hired by the cops." "I've never killed a human being in my life." His irritability had risen now, had become outright hostility. Erin said, "Just those poor Andes." "I notice you've never had any hesitation as to spending the bounty money I bring home on whatever momentarily attracts your attention." He rose, strode to the console of his mood organ. "Instead of saving," he said, "so we could buy a real sheep to replace that fake electric one upstairs. A mere electric animal, and me earning all that I've worked my way up to through the years." At his console he hesitated between dialing for a thalamic suppressant, which would abolish his mood of rage, or a thalamic stimulant, which would make him irked enough to win the argument. "If you dial," Erin said, her eyes open and watching, "for greater venom, then I'll dial the same. I'll dial the maximum, and you'll see a fight that makes every argument we've had up to now seem like nothing. Dial and see. Just try me." She rose swiftly, loped to the console of her own mood organ, stood glaring at him, waiting. He sighed, defeated by her threat. "I'll dial what's on my schedule for today." Examining the schedule for January 3, 2021, he saw that a businesslike professional attitude was called for. "If I dial by schedule," he said warily, "will you agree to also?" He waited, canny enough not to commit himself until his wife had agreed to follow suit. "My schedule for today lists a 6-hour self-accusatory depression," Erin said.
Okay.
Right, how many unexplained or like new things did you tally in there?
All right, here's my list. Some of them are sort of subcategories. So,
Yeah.
Mood organ. Then we get Penfield, which we later figure out is the same thing, but we don't quite know that right away.
Mm-hmm.
Settings, again related to the mood organ, the Penfield. Setting D, again related to all of these things, but we still don't know. Then we get cop hands. So he's a cop. No, he's not a cop. No, he's a murderer employed by the cop. No, he's never killed anybody. Only the Andes. These are all in the same category of one thing, but each of those phrases doesn't really make sense. Perhaps if you're paying close attention and you know the title of the book is Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, perhaps you might map Andy to Android, and then maybe it would all make sense based on that. Real sheep, electric sheep, thalamic suppressant, again related to the mood organ, although I don't know what a thalamic suppressant / stimulus is, and schedule. which appears to have something to do with the mood organ too. So that's my list, and I would say it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 of the minor ones, but you could also probably divide those up into 1, 2, 3, 4 super categories.
Yeah, and then kind of my follow-up question is like, in this rereading of the book, like, what was your experience of that information? Like, was it dislocating? Did it flow easily? Like, tell me about your experience of encountering all of that new information.
Well, okay, so context. I picked up this book and tried to read it probably around 2010, and maybe got 3 or 4 chapters in. I could remember the mood organ. I could remember the pseudo religion. I could remember. That was about it. Those were the two. And I remembered Kipple. For some reason, Kipple had stuck in my brain. Because I think, do you remember a few weeks ago, I was like, oh yeah, we're going to talk about Kipple. I was
like, what? And you were like, yeah, Kipple. And, it's like the accretion of crap.
And I had remembered that correctly. Yeah. And Mercerism. Yeah. So I remembered those things. So coming back into it this time, and also, to be clear, this scene did not exist in the movie Blade Runner, which I've seen at least twice. This time I was like, oh yeah, the mood organ. So I remembered what that was. I think that the first time I read it, I think I figured out more or less what was going on by the time I got to the end of the chapter. And, we were talking, we did a little mini-sode recently where I was talking with you and Lindsay Lajoie, where I gave myself credit for being like a good sci-fi reader that, sort of good at those sort of picking up little linguistic clues to sort of figure out, okay, what's going on. But it's still a weird scene because even when you parse everything that's happening and you understand, okay, this is a married couple, he's a bounty hunter, he kills androids, they're having an argument, they have something called a mood organ, he wants to use it to dial their moods into something happy, she doesn't want to do that because she feels like it's inauthentic in some way. It's still a hard scene to kind of make emotional sense of. I honestly, I don't know if this is just clunky writing or if it's intentionally this way. I can't tell to what degree they're bantering or if this is kind of real anger. I start to get the sense that it is real anger, but of course when she's sort of like, get your filthy cop hands off me, I'm like, wait, these people are married and she talks to him this way? Is this like love banter? And then you get so twisted and tangled with this sort of question of like, she wants to dial depression. She wants to dial depression because she thinks that dialing happiness is sort of inauthentic and she should be connected to sort of real human emotions. But then her solution to that is to dial for depression, which also seems similarly inauthentic too. And then in the end, he solves the problem by agreeing to this compromise. Then he says, you know what, I'll just dial for both of us. And then he dials a setting in which the wife is dialed into the mood that's sort of like contentment and awareness of the husband's wisdom in all things. And that's like the end of the scene. And you're like, was that supposed to be funny? Was that supposed to be really disturbing? It is certainly, given what this book is about, it is certainly setting up artificiality and artifice as a hardcore theme, right? And we know whether you've seen Blade Runner or not, or once you start reading a little bit and maybe you've read the back of the book, you understand at some point pretty soon that this is a guy who hunts androids. He hunts robots, and that robots are fake people. But then, of course, and I think like this time reading it, the most recent time reading it, I definitely caught that metaphoric, that sort of symbolic language, which is like, oh, the humans in this book choose their emotions using a machine. Yeah. I think we're being asked what is human and what is a machine in this moment too. So yeah, those were mine. How about you?
Yeah. I think I'm in the same place. Like I found this to be. I really hope that it's like a wonderful high wire act of irony, which is what it feels like. I mean, it's written in 1968, so like maybe not, maybe there are, but I don't think so. It like the lady doth protest too much, methinks. And I really do think that Dick here is pointing us tastefully in the direction of human hypocrisy. And I just thought that I was like, oh my God, like if we substitute antidepressants for the mood organ,
Sure.
like this is a conversation from now.
It is, but it also that this scene and much of this book also does feel very 1960s to me. You know,
Oh yeah.
You know,
is there a non-female secretary
Sure.
seen anywhere?
Sure. No, it's weird because like Philip K. Dick has given us all these futuristic sort of premise things like rocket planes and androids and mechanical sheep on the roof and all of these and Mercerism and mood organs, and yet the structure of society is like watching Mad Men. You know, it's like guys in business,
totally.
like white guys in business suits talking to each other in transatlantic accents, sort of trying to outdo each other in various kinds of like genteel pissing contests. You know, that I mean,
Yes.
it's just like watching Don Draper. You know, and the argument they have, I think partly why it gave me pause, it was like watching like Cary Grant and like, you know, Katharine Hepburn have an argument, you know, like, don't you touch that mood organ. I like it just the way it is right now. No, woman, you listen to me. We're going to set the mood organ for what we agreed to set it to. And the husband's always right. You know, and I was just like, it was cartoonish, and I couldn't tell if that was intended or if that's just the way Philip K. Dick thought that people were going to talk in the future. That was very strange. And I will say, and this is going to get to my second question, is that as I really like this chapter now, having gotten through this first half, and I went back and read that chapter again today too. I like it a lot. It really rewards a second reading or even a third reading. But I also felt like we were in a slow start. It takes us.
That's funny. I'm going to let you get to your next question. I didn't find it slow starting.
Okay, well, that was my question. Like, yeah, I mean, and why not? Well, here's my rationale, which is our inciting incident doesn't really come until like another 2 chapters, right? It's not really till Deckard gets to work and he gets assigned, you know, what's his name, Dave Holden or Bill Holden's. So
the names are like wildly unmemorable,
incredibly like 1960s
except for the
waspy
androids, who are like, you're like Pokolov,
Luba
Lufta,
yeah. Yeah,
it's like he's like sifting through the villain book from like Superdog.
Yeah, it's really funny. Yeah, you know, it's right that the androids' names are sort of ethnic, and the bounty hunters all seem like, you know, just like middle-aged white guys with middle-aged waspy names.
His boss's name is like Howard Bryant. Like you're right. It's 100% the cast of Mad Men.
Yeah. Howard, get down here right away. Like test coming from the Russian department. You should read about this.
Deckard. Yeah, I didn't think this was a slow start because for me, for some reason, this hit exactly the level of in media res that I really enjoy. There was enough detail of like what the world is like. And I hear all sorts of counter arguments about the opening of Neuromancer Brewing, but like something about the writing here really works for me. And I think it's because I know what world I'm in. I'm like, oh, okay. Again, we're in a sort of like a different kind of noir than Neuromancer. You're totally right. It is like Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn, like, you know, Philadelphia story in it around. But like, I really love how he just tosses us in, and the narration is really simple other than the information that we're getting. And I think that is what is really working. There's no attempt to kind of dress up the prose in any way. And he just kind of lets this conversation unspool as a bit of a way to get us into the world. And so, yeah, we don't get the inciting incident for a little bit, but I'm intrigued. I'm like, wait a second, why is she dialing a 6-hour self-accusatory depression? I mean, I laughed out loud at that particular moment. I just really loved the conversation between them that let us learn so much about this world and the animals and the war. And yeah, it's very obviously an expositional plant, but it is one that I think is really working.
Okay, well, I will say I didn't get through. I stalled out after about 3 chapters, and so, for me, I found this to be a challenging start. And if we weren't doing this as a podcast, I don't know that I would have picked it up again and read it. But I do think it's rewarded that. To me, I have a note somewhere where I wrote this book's virtues are slow to reveal themselves. But by the time we got to the first half, I'm like, okay, I totally want to know where this is going to. And even though I've seen the movie that was made on this feels like it could end in a totally different way. It's source material, but it's not a faithful adaptation at all, So I get what you're saying, but unfortunately it didn't work for me that way.
Where does it start working for you?
Well, I think the first Isidore chapter, I think, is just masterful. And it's one of the things that's happening, although I will say that it sort of threw me off as I was reading it pretty recently. The first time I read it, I was like, man, he's just dumping a lot of exposition on us. Isn't that supposed to be against the rules? I found my sort of writing teacher alarm going off, but then I was like, well, I'll just go with it. And one of the things that's amazing about that chapter is the narration starts out at sort of godlike levels of, and then it's almost as though the omniscient narrator is sort of Google Earth zooming closer and closer and closer in on Isidore until we're actually in his brain. And I actually thought that was a really cool trick. And there are moments, I'll see if I can find one really quick, of exposition that did feel... It's kind of like Steinbeck, where Steinbeck just sort of I'm just going to tell you what I think is going on in this world that I'm describing. It's got that same kind of quality where he's just sort of and then the colonists left because there was too much radiation. I really started to enjoy it with the Luba Loof chapter. And just, I love how, so she's basically, one of the things she's doing, he suspects that she is an android. She is kind of pretending to cooperate, but she is either actually doesn't understand this weird empathy test, or is pretending not to understand it, or is doing some combination of both because she really doesn't fully understand it because she is an android and according to, Deckard anyway, incapable of empathy, but then she's using her sort of linguistic confusion and other types of confusion to obscure her actual empathetic confusion. And that is just done so well. I loved that. Then I will say I got annoyed because I thought that the device that got him, Deckard, from there to the fake android police station was very clumsy. And there were a number of times where I'm like, look, if the whole point of this fake police station is to give Luba Loof an escape and an out, they're going to have to kill Deckard at some point. And they had many chances to do that they did not take. And then finally the guy tries to do it at the worst possible time and gets sawed in half by a laser. And I was just plotting wise, I found that very, very clunky. But I loved the premise of Deckard. I loved the premise of the fake police station, and I love the premise of Deckard meeting up and teaming up with another bounty hunter who he strongly suspects is an android.
Yeah.
The subtext is it's impossible to not wonder whether Deckard himself might be an android too at this moment. And that has actively been suggested by Luba Loof. And it is also implied, just by the fact that the other investigator, whose name is Resh or something like that, or it's well, if he could be one, why couldn't, and have fake memories implanted in him? Certainly that could be the case for Deckard. I also found the plotting a little clumsy around the Cohen-Nice test, the way, particularly in the way that once he sort of sees through the ruse, they're all right, well, whatever, we tried, we almost got you. Anyway, here's what we were thinking, and this is why we tried to trick you. Just that whole back and forth with them, and the fact that it took him so long to see through the ruse too. So, and basically the ruse is he tests her, the niece. The test appears to indicate that she's an android. And then both of them are aha, we tricked you. She's not an android. She just grew up on a spaceship. And so she doesn't she doesn't have the references that would make sense for this test. And she also doesn't have the values of an earthbound human. A lot of the test has to do with cruelty to animals, which all humans of this era find intolerable. But if you think about it, humans of our era would quite often fail this test because
totally.
we're not nearly as empathetic to the suffering of animals as people are in this particular future. So it's an interesting moment. But I don't know. There were a number of moments that I found really clumsy like that too. But I will say that those three premises, like the raising the question around the test, Lubalouf's evasion of the test, and then sort of like the fake android police officer, those ideas are just so fun that at this point I'm kind of drawn in, and I like what it's setting Deckard up for, even though I thought it kind of clunkily kind of limped its way there at moments.
Yeah, like he is, I mean, his command of ideas and expressing ideas in a way that makes you be like, whoa, is, is up there with the best.
Yeah, that's what we're here. We're here for the ideas, right?
Yeah.
We're not
right,
really
totally.
here for the plotting, although there is some wonderful lyricism too.
Yeah, his blocking. Like, you would never let Philip K. Dick block a stage play. He'd be like, just stand where you are.
And talk.
I like how now my version of Philip K. Dick is like an FDR accent.
Yeah.
Like, just stand where you are and talk, say some words.
Right. Yeah, no, it is. It's like that. Yeah. And I mean, like just the moment where the police chief pulls the laser gun out at him and then Deckard's like, it'll never work. The bounty hunter will make you test anyway. Might as well give it up. And he's like, yeah, you're right. I'll put away my laser gun now. It's like, and they're just kind of standing there. There's this kind of waspy politeness that they're doing. It's really funny where they're sort of like, well, we suspect that this man is a replicant, and he's probably here to try to kill us all. And, he was harassing this woman, which is why we brought him in, and there's absolutely no evidence that he is who he says he is. But at the same time, we have to kind of take him seriously, don't we? Just because he's a white man like the rest of us.
When we're doing crimes, we have to remember that logic is the thing that is superior above all.
Yeah, that part is awfully clunky. But yeah, once you sort of realize... once I realized that this book is going to be about testing and categories and fake versus real, then I'm sort of hooked. And, I've seen the movie twice at least, probably 3 times. And those themes are in that movie too, but played very differently. They're not treated in the same way.
So this is from the J.R. Isidore chapter. It's on page 20 of my edition. And we did this a little while ago when we talked about tone. I got up on my soapbox and was like, tone is not mood or atmosphere.
Right.
Tone is the author's attitude towards his subject material. Mood and atmosphere are the general emotional feeling of the work. I want to read this section, and I want you to tell me what you feel like the mood is.
Sure. The
mood or the atmosphere of this section or this passage and the world that it describes. So this is J.R. Isidore. He's in his apartment. He's listening to an interview of some emigrants. And the way the emigrants are kind of described as sort of like a vacant and tired. Like the emigrants are saying that things are good, but you get this sneaking suspicion that maybe it's not.
And when you say immigrants, they have left Earth and they're on some colony, right?
Yeah,
some
they're either
space
on Mars or the moon.
Right.
There's this wonderful sentence from J.R. Isidore's point of view where he says something like, the contempt of 3 planets descended upon him. Mm. And you're like, oh.
Yep.
So he's just turned the television off. Silence. It flashed from the woodwork and the walls. It smote him with an awful, total power, as if generated by a vast mill. It rose up from the floor, up out of the tattered gray wall-to-wall carpeting. It unleashed itself from the broken and semi-broken appliances in the kitchen, the dead machines which hadn't worked in all the time Isidore had lived here. From the useless pole lamp in the living room it oozed out, meshing with the empty and wordless descent of itself from the fly-specked ceiling. It managed, in fact, to emerge from every object within his range of vision, as if it, the silence, meant to supplant all things tangible. Hence it assailed not only his ears, but his eyes. As he stood by the inert TV set, he experienced the silence as visible and, in its own way, alive. Alive! He had often felt its austere approach before. When it came, it burst in without subtlety, evidently unable to wait. The silence of the world could not rein back its greed, not any longer, not when it had virtually won. He wondered, then, if the others who had remained on Earth experienced the void this way, or was it peculiar to his peculiar biological identity, a freak generated by his inept sensory apparatus? Interesting question, Isidore thought. But whom could he compare notes with? He lived alone in this deteriorating, blind building of 1,000 uninhabited apartments, which, like all its counterparts, fell, day by day, into greater and tropic ruin. Eventually, everything within the building would merge, would be faceless and identical, mere pudding-like kipple piled to the ceiling of each apartment. And, after that, the uncared-for building itself would settle into shapelessness, buried under the ubiquity of the dust. By then, naturally, he himself would be dead. Another interesting event to anticipate as he stood here in his stricken living room alone with the lungless, all-penetrating, masterful world silence.
Yeah, I really like the narration in this chapter. To me, the mood is loneliness, resignation, and then a kind of strange introspection overlaid, a kind of interesting analytical quality. And it's weird because Isidore is supposed to be very stupid, but he's very self-aware, and he's constantly kind of evaluating his own state of mind too, and trying to, he's considering his loneliness and resignation and wondering, is it because of his brain damage, or is it internal to him, or is it external to the world? And kind of wishing for somebody to compare notes with.
If you were to describe like tactile, or like sensory, touch, feeling, smell, like what kind of words would you use to describe this environment?
I mean, the silence affects his eyes.
Yeah.
It's almost like a synesthesic thing. Like, I imagine the silence as this sort of like gray, green, kippley. The kipple is a good analogy for this. A sort of dusty, gray rubble mass that's slowly gathering around him and preparing to envelop him and convert him into itself. Into kibble, into dust.
Kipple, yeah.
Yeah, and there's kipple and there's dust, but it's sort of all merged together. That's the sense I have. It's almost like the trash compactor scene in Star Wars, except for happening very, very slowly. And slowly enough that rather than like Luke and Han being like, oh my God, we got to get out of here, turn off the... Instead, they're sort of like, well, one day we're going to get crushed.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like... It's dense, it's oppressive, it is slow, but it is like you can't get away from it. It's inexorable. It feels so massive and brooding and heavy. And I love the gray-green thing that you're coming up with. And it just as an exercise in mood, I think this is so great. The number of useless, tattered, semi-broken, empty, fly speck. It's just like austere. It's just this like huge thing that is coming for us all.
But do you also, I mean, I get the sense from Isidore too, and maybe it's his dialogue. I also have this sense of kind of a level of calm about it.
Yeah.
That it's not that he's living in terror of this. There's a kind of resignation, and that to some degree he even takes some comfort in his introspection. Do you know, at one point he uses the word interesting, you know, that it's going to be
almost interesting event to anticipate.
Right. Yeah, it is. It is an exquisite bouquet of dour emotion.
Yeah, it's great. And it's so easy for a passage like this to turn into too much.
Yeah.
And he's done a really nice job of picking and creating a character for whom this narration isn't too much. And I think that's kind of the genius of Isidore here. You see the movie, you do meet a character named JR who has this same sort of hapless, stuttering, kind of helplessness that helps kind of power his connection to the replicants in the movie.
Right.
And you feel like that there's a little bit of that here too. There's kind of the, like the kid who doesn't see that his best friend is a robot sort of thing.
Right.
And I just reading this, I was like, what kind of book are we in? Like, it was I felt like I was reading Thomas Hardy.
So, coming out of that, maybe my question this raises too, I agree. I love this chapter. Do you feel like the book holds together? Or does it feel, sometimes I kind of experience it as like every chapter is its own brilliant surrealist short story, but with a different mood. I don't feel like the mood is consistent. I feel like sometimes we're doing irony, sometimes we're doing Katharine Hepburn and the Philadelphia Story and satire, sometimes we're doing cat and mouse detective, and sometimes we're doing
Keeping Up with the Jetsons,
and sometimes we're doing like creeping Kipple oppressive loneliness surrounding, so I'm just curious, like, does it feel like one thing to you, or does it feel
no,
like
it doesn't. there's a little of, there's hints of the neuromancer problem here, but not for me, but not as much as the neuromancer issue, because I think that Philip K. Dick really has a sense of what he wants to do and say. But I think you're totally right that each of these chapters is sort of a brilliant expose of whatever it is he's trying to get across in that chapter. And it's almost always entertaining. And then sometimes it's just kind of weird. Yeah. Like when he kills Pokolov, like, there's just this odd moment where he's like, he even says the wrong thing. He's like, you're not Pokolov, you're Kadali.
I like that.
And then the android's like, aren't you getting that reversed? And I'm like, wait a second. And then then the laser doesn't work and he blows his head off.
Right. Well, there's also a moment there too where it feels like we're reading a comic book, because the android says something like, no matter, my laser doesn't work, I'll just wring your pencil neck.
You're right.
Which it feels like you're reading like a Stan Lee comic from 1962. That can't stop Dr. Doom.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. I don't know. I wonder why it's not bothering me as much. I think because the density of the sentences is turned down in a way that I found Neuromancer to be like 50% overwritten, and I think I find this about 10% underwritten in terms of like the blocking and the stitching of the scenes together and stuff like that. I do really love his willingness to just take us to the next scene. Like, there's one where he's like, leaves the police department, and I think the next paragraph is like, his hover car settled down on top of the Rosen Corporation in Seattle. And I was like, God damn it, now that is some economical travel writing.
Sure. Yeah. I also, I love his just willingness to get weird. It's sort of like every chapter to me feels like a different episode of The Twilight Zone.
Yeah,
it does maybe bother me a little bit that I don't think they hold together that well. It feels like I'm reading a collection of short stories that are thematically linked, and also kind of form something like a plot. And I mean, there definitely is a plot, right? Deckard has to hunt down all the androids. Is he going to do it? Is he not? Are they going to kill him first? Is he an android? I mean, like, there, you get all that stuff, but I'm at my happiest in this book when I'm just sort of reflecting at the events of a particular chapter. And I do, though, find myself being very aware that I'm reading a book a lot of the time as I'm reading this book. And I'm sort of like, oh, that was a wonderful sentence, Mr. Dick. Or like, oh, wow, Mr. Dick, what a fascinating premise. As opposed to just kind of immersive. And maybe that's my question to you, is this a good story?
Huh.
And it's a separate question from, is it a good book?
Right. And it's a separate question from, is it a good plot?
Right.
Yeah, because plot is a mechanical thing that writers do, and they do it well or they do it poorly, in the same way that a singer or a musician is going to play chords effectively or poorly. Is it a good book is a valid question, and also a gigantic subjective question.
Right.
And is it a good story? I feel like is kind of in between. It's sort of the combination of a writer's ability to plot and their ability to deploy the ideas in a mostly seamless way that eventually makes the reader read the next sentence and believe enough of the current sentence to read the next sentence. Is it a good story? Boy, that's a great question. It's a very simple setup with a very interesting philosophical idea behind it. I have been finding myself easily reading the next sentence and sort of tearing through it. It's a good page turner. So I do want to know what happens next, but I'm more interested in what happens to JR. Like, that's we sort of leave JR as he's wondering about his new neighbor. And even though I know that the action is mostly going to revolve around Deckard, I find the story pulled back there because it's weird. He's like a wonderful, strange character. Yeah. And this woman who has moved in first says that her name is Rachel Rosen, which we know is not true. And then says that it's a different name, that her name is Pris or something like that. And then is like, no, you should just call me Miss Stratton. And it's just, I want to see that story unfurl. I'm happy to go along for the ride. It feels a little weird that it feels a little video gamey. Like, he's like, great, killed one, on to the next one.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I care that much about Deckard. And I find him maybe so cartoonish that he's starting to feel bad. But the other bounty hunter gets him out of the police station, which is a dangerous place for Deckard. And Deckard has this moment of sort of like, an android just helped me out, and I might have to retire him. Oh, what irony. Like Deckard, it kind of like, we were talking about Case being a meathead. I feel like Deckard's a double meathead,
Yeah. It's like, dude, can you have some more emotional introspection than whether or not you can afford a fucking ostrich?
Well, maybe he can't because he is incapable of empathy because of his construction. I mean, I honestly don't know. Have you read this book before?
I don't think I have.
Yeah.
I think this is my first time.
Yeah, and like I said, I don't know what's going to happen. I got 3 chapters into it. I certainly, where I sense we're certainly going is Deckard is going to have some realization in which he is no longer able to tell the difference between an android and a human, and those categories are going to collapse. I think that's where we're headed. But what he does about that, and whether that is him or whether that is something or somebody that he cares about, or whether, I don't know. And yeah, I have no idea what's going to happen to Isidore. And I agree, he's much more likable. He's the most likable character in the book, really. So sad. I was reading that chapter again, the one that you just read from it just a little bit beforehand, and I was like, man, this is bleak. This is a man with no hope whatsoever, as far as I can tell. His body has been wrecked. He's slowly being poisoned. all of his trajectory is downward. Although then he has that moment of sort of like doing the good customer service call, and I'm like, where is that going to take us? You know, like,
I know.
like maybe can he take his IQ test again? You know, like this time with a like, you know, penalty for neurodivergent people or a handicap, like
Totally.
you know, like I am really fascinated in what's going to happen, and I'm definitely up for the second. The book has hooked me now. You know, for me, it was a slow start, and it took me a little bit. But, you know, I would not put it down at this point, even if we were not making a podcast about it.
Do you believe that the chief of police of the San Francisco Police Department has sway with the Russian intelligence system?
Well, okay. So remind me, what is the plot point in which he specifically is said to have sway with the...
There's like this whole section where it's like, it seems that the Rosen Corporation's ability to continue doing work hinges on Chief of Police Bryant, and also like there is some level of, it's posited that there's some level of agreement between the Chief of Police and like the Russian police state. Mm-hmm. And it just struck me as like, those seem really incongruous.
Okay, so here's how I understood those plot points, and I may have missed something. I mean, the book is a little bit dense at times, but I understood that the Russian intelligence got in touch with the San Francisco police because of the Nexus 6 had escaped and were thought to be in Northern California. So this is a major escape. And the San Francisco Police Department is the relevant local authority, but also because they had some information that the test they use for droids might not work in certain cases. And in this case, it was schizophrenic humans with flat affect or something like that, which we learn that Deckard and his wife have flat affect, or there's some reference to that earlier in the book too. So I didn't necessarily think that the San Francisco police chief was influencing the Russian intelligence agency, but instead was being contacted by them. Now, I did understand that they might have some power to make things difficult for the Rosen Android Corporation or whatever they're called, but they also, it seems like their hands are tied because of some kind of jurisdiction of the Rosen's parent company being on Mars or something like that. Yeah. Apparently their parent company is an automobile manufacturer on Mars. So they're able to sort of avoid regulation, you know, not unlike the Tessier ash pools and not unlike the Musks. And I didn't fully understand all that. I didn't fully understand that scene, but I do think that Android company would be in trouble if it turned out that there was no reliable way to distinguish their androids from humans. But again, this feels like clunky plotting because they're the ones trying to sabotage the test that Deckard uses. So again, it's a little bit weird. It's a little bit confusing. Maybe there's an explanation in the book for that. But I mean, again, I think there's some clunky plotting sometimes. The characters behave in ways that just feel a little bit inexplicable. And it's kind of just like Dick's just got to like get Deckard to the next set piece. It's like when we're in Luba Loof's dressing room, he's like, okay, what's the next cool idea? It's the police station full of androids. How do we get him there? Android cop. And I'm like, yeah, but if the android cop's working with Luba Loof, why don't they just kill him and hide the body? Right. You know, like that's what they're going to do anyway, right? So they keep the ruse going and then the ruse falls apart. There are a number of little moments like that where you're sort of like, well, if this is what they're trying to do, you would think they would have done it more effectively. Yeah.
And yeah, I think your explanation fits with the book, and it's what the book is trying to explain either also. But it was just, that was another one of those moments where I was like, that feels off.
And like all of these plot points, I think, are probably solvable with a little bit of work or some cleverness, you know? And yeah, I don't quite know what to make of that. I wonder, is this one of those things where it's like, I remember when I was listening to Bob Dylan for the first time, maybe as like a young teenager, and I was a little bit underwhelmed because I was like, oh, this is just like a bunch of other people I've heard who are on the radio today. And then you sort of have to do your history and you have to be like, none of those people would be doing that thing without Bob Dylan. So Philip K. Dick, but it may be part of what's going on here is that the idea of androids masquerading as police officers is just like embedded in. That's not that hard for me to swallow just because it's been around. I've seen Terminator, I've seen Terminator 2. I've seen a bunch of things that Philip K. Dick influenced such that the ideas, I'm like, I get it, whatever. Like they're replicants or they're androids. Okay. Like because of that, maybe a reader at the time would have just been too busy having their mind blown by some of the layers of abstraction and sophistication and things like that, and what is real and what's not real, and the way that metaphoric is played across in so many different ways that they might not have noticed the clunkiness. And it's once those ideas are digested, that's when you start seeing the seams, and the seams start kind of bothering you a little bit more. Perhaps.
Yeah, I think you've totally hit on my issue with Neuromancer. Is like when I layer on my 2023 understanding of like digital stuff and cyberpunk and whatnot, then the world of Neuromancer begins to crumble a little bit in a way that's unfair to 1984 William Gibson. Right. And I think you did that was a really good explanation of why this book is, I think, succeeding, but also a little clunky.
Well, shall we go to trivia?
Okay. So the Voight-Kampff test in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is the measure of empathy that a human or an android can display, empathy appearing to be the thing that separates humans and androids in this bizarro world. Kampf means struggle or fight, and it's a word with some unsavory associations in our world. Voight means A, people, B, overseer or enforcer, or C, business person.
People, overseer, or business person. I'm going to go with B, overseer.
You are correct.
Woo!
Yes. Voight-Kampff basically translates to overseer struggle. It's very funny. I was digging around on this because I was like, well, I know what Kampf means because of Mein Kampf. And then Karl Ove Knausgaard, the Norwegian writer with like the 6-volume autobiography, he called that Mein Kampf. It's called My Struggle, in sort of like a very gutsy act of Hitler appropriation.
Right.
And so I was like, okay, I know that Kampf means struggle. Philip K. Dick is like way too smart a person for Voight not to really mean something here. And yeah, I think overseer struggle is really like, that's the thing this book is about.
Yeah, I know that Dick had read a lot of like biographies of Hitler and Third Reich and stuff like that. And he isn't, one of his novels is about an alternative history where the Germans and Japanese won World War II. That makes sense. I didn't know that. I was kind of going with cognates, and part of the reason I had that guess is that it seems like often cognates like a Voight or Veit are used. If you think about like Watchmen, isn't kind of the Superman-like character Adrian Veidt or Voight or something, and I think that's the case in The Boys. That sort of thing that feels a lot like Watchmen, isn't it? Voight Corporation that like made the superheroes, and so that was where I was getting that guess from, is that sort of association. I also was pretty sure Voight did not mean people. So,
well, I threw that in there because of Volk.
Volk.
I was trying to lead you astray with Volk because I could see people struggle as another, perhaps thing for this.
Yeah, is it the struggle to determine whether this is a person? Right.
Yeah, and business person struggle, I thought also, I'd be like, well, that's a very German way to like talk about capitalism. I think you could also run this book through like a real strong like Marxist critical theory lens, and it would be really cool.
There's some. Yeah, there's a lot going on. I mean, similar to Neuromancer, in terms of like who's working for whom, and who ultimately is, the powerful entity, in these cases. All right, so your trivia. I'm actually just mentioned The Man in the High Castle, which is the other famous Philip K. Dick novel. Many consider it to be the better book, his best novel, but it's the sort of the other prominent one. And one theory for why it's good is that he, in plotting out the novel, opted to surrender control of the characters' destinies to a kind of semi-randomized process, if that makes sense, in
Wonderful.
the following way. So, A, he did that by consulting the I Ching. B, he randomized their destinies with a rudimentary 12-sided die, which he created from a dodecahedron he found at an import store, which was originally associated with Vietnam and the Silk Road. C, he assigned the characters the same destinies as characters in the Christopher Marlowe play Tamburlaine the Great.
I Ching, rudimentary 12-sided die, Tamburlaine the Great.
By Christopher Marlowe. Not like an Italian ripoff.
Not Afra Ben or, John Webster.
For God's sake.
He's 2-bit Elizabethan hacks.
Yeah. Christopher Marlowe is like the Scottie Pippen of ancient playwriting.
Do you know how Christopher Marlowe died?
No.
He was stabbed in the eye.
Does that actually happen in Shakespeare in Love? Doesn't Marlowe die midway through the movie?
I think that movie is pretty close to. They do play. John Webster shows up in a very funny little aside. He's the boy who is feeding the mice to cats.
Right.
Do you like plays? I like them when they're bloody. I'm going to go with. You're so good at this, and I've been so wrong so often. Don't think it's Tamburlaine the Great for some reason. I am gonna go with B.
It's A. Consult the I Ching.
Darn it.
I feel guilty because a rudimentary 12-sided die for a D&D guy is it's such bait.
And also there was so much detail, and I need to start like whatever the one is the most detailed now is your tell. I need to start. I do like this though. I'm infinitely more comfortable when you are winning trivia every time.
I don't know that I'm winning every time. Also, if you go back to the beginning of the first few episodes, you tended to get the trivia more often than I did. But
yeah, and then you went on a run, and then I went on a run, and again now I'm in a slump.
Yeah,
but
and we're heading into the postseason.
JPD. What are we doing next?
We're doing the second half of this book, chapters 12 through 22 of Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And I don't know what's going to happen.
We're doing the second half of this book. I'm going to read the credits like I'm from Boston. So Up a Middle Brow is a small point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes are the real sheep of our production team.
Sheesh.
Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by Chris Bagg. You can learn more about us at upamiddlebrow.com. We could use some more ratings and reviews.
I don't know what accent to do my part in. I don't know. I could try. I don't know that I certainly don't have the Boston accent. And a reminder, Chris and I are both writers and editors and can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbagg.com and jessedukes.com. Check it out. Get in touch if you want to talk about how we can help you with your project, big or small. Buddy.